But I do want to touch on some of the things you said, though. I mean, number one, shout out to you for being willing to work in the school because, like we were just talking about, there's not enough men that do it. I have a client who I work with pro bono who is a teacher, is a black male teacher, and up in Tallahassee, and I understand a bit about some of the challenges that teachers face. I actually give him this paradigm a lot as I talk about, he's in a female dominated field, I'm in a female dominated field. So there's certain things that we can inherently understand about each other and how it might be different. I want to ask you a question before I give you more feedback because I'm curious what you would say because I know what he said. When it comes to troubled students, particularly if you're talking about troubled male students, do you think that part of the reason that they maybe get those referrals or they're being escorted out of the classroom, do you think any part of that has to do with who's teaching in that classroom and with their ability to maybe relate to some of the circumstances that that young man or young woman may be dealing with in their personal life?
I think the appropriate answer is yes. Not in all cases, but in many cases for sure. I mean, and the data national wide shows that. So that's not like, I'm not saying it's not a hot take from me or anything super controversial. I mean, the data shows that black and brown males specifically are written up at a disproportionate rate compared to their female counterparts and their white counterparts. So, I mean, that's what the data shows, and it has effects on long-term effects. Like our black and brown males are not going to college. It's a lot lower rate than their female counterparts, their white counterparts. So it definitely what happens in the K-12 system, to your point, it does have some long-lasting effects for sure. But the other side of that too, RJ, is you have people that look like you and their experience. I was just having and maybe I'm pushing it, but let me just toss this out here. And if we want to scrap it, we can scrap it. But I was just having this conversation with a good friend of mine. We were talking about what it means to be black and how people define this differently, and how my black experience may look completely different than your black experience. Right. And you can use that for any race. But since we're, focusing on people of color right now, we're going to stay in this realm. Right. So I've run into black educators that have a very different black experience than what I had and then what their students have. So even though in your mind, it's like, oh, they look like me, their experience is totally different. They can't even connect with the student at the level that they are. Right. So I say that to say, because I want to make sure that we're clear. Like, we're not saying, oh, it's because they're white teachers in there. Because I got a white educator that's right down here from the street from me, Mr. Meechin. He was my former principal. If that ain't one of the most brothers that I know up in his piece. And his work is primarily with black and brown students. Like, he mentors black and brown kids, and it's the way our students gravitate to him is absolutely insane. So we're not saying that it's the general sweeping idea is, oh, if you're white, you can't relate to black and brown kids, or if you're black, you can't. That's not what we're saying. But what we are saying, that there are times where we find who is in the classroom because they don't empathize or find a way to connect with those students or try to understand what their situation is. Yes, they will go to more punitive ways of punishing a student as opposed to redirecting and actually, what I would say, is teaching. We're teaching academics, but we're also teaching life skills, and that means
say that for the camera one more time, please, sir.
We're not just teaching academics, we're teaching life skills. So my job in the classroom is to prepare you for life once you leave the K-12 system. So I need to know how to equip you academically, if that's the route you want to take. But I also have to learn how to equip you socially, because you're going to leave me. And if you show your butt out in my classroom with that anger because I said something you didn't like, when you get out into the real world, you're going to get that times 10. And I got to make sure you're equipped so that you don't respond ill and have consequences that you'll further regret, right? So, and I think my advantage was because I was a counselor, so it was easier for me.
I have no doubt that played a significant role.
We would have family time. We would have family meetings in my classroom. Like, we would have those discussions and really process emotions, process social skills and things like that. That was important to me, and that's what made my classroom like it was like a family. My kids were open with me, honest with me, with each other. We didn't have fights. We didn't have a lot of arguments. We had a lot of fun. I'll tell you this one thing because I know you're about to say what you're about to say. So it's funny because I just got nominated for this fellows program with NCAN, and a lot of my kids that I taught saw the post. And they're coming out the woodworks right now, RJ. Like, I don't do what I do for accolades. People that know me
Sure.
know my head's down, my hands on the plow. Like, I'm working. I just work. Like, I just want to make impact and change. I'm like in the trenches
Correct.
doing whatever I need to do. So it was good for me to see this. My kids are coming out like, oh my gosh, that's the best teacher I've had, best counselor I've had. Do y'all remember when we used to have family meetings? Do y'all remember when Mr. Cook would just swallow a cupcake whole when we used to play shoe jackers at the playground? Like all this crazy stuff that I forgot that I did with them. When we would do science experiments and it would be a mess in the room and like district people would come in and he'd be like, oh, we about to get in trouble. Like that's just how we rolled. I'm glad that my kids had a positive experience. And in part, it wasn't just academics, but I had to meet them where they were as people, you know?
There you go.
That
No,
to me is
that's
so
big
important.
facts. Big facts, man. I definitely want to support and encourage everything that you just said there. And I definitely appreciate the clarification. I often say on pretty much every episode that Black people are not a monolith,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
like you were saying earlier, the brother I was speaking about, he's of Jamaican descent, so there's a slightly different angle in how he grew up and how actually that plays a role in how he how he teaches and how he handles it. And so I like to always distinguish that so that people understand just because you're in the skin does not mean that you inherently understand all of my lived experiences. What it can mean though is there are some commonalities that
Yeah.
we do experience, and it helps to not have to always express and articulate that.
Yeah.
Right, it kind of
Yeah.
saves a little bit of time. We can kind of jump into the meat of what are you struggling with, what are you having difficulty with, how can I help you.
Yeah.
But to your point, the reason why I asked you that question is because, again, I'm not like an educator, but I've spent a fair amount of time both in higher ed and obviously being around K through 12 students. And it's been just general observation, I would say, that young men are perceived being more aggressive and angry and hostile. Now, to be fair to probably the female teachers, I can understand that because a lot of the environments they come from. And when
Mhm.
environments, I don't just mean like the hood they grow up in, because everybody didn't grow up in the hood. It could just be that the household that they in was very, very hostile.
Yeah.
Right, between mom and dad, like you were expressing from your lived experience. So that young man is bringing that into his school, or that young woman is bringing that into her school. So it's not to say that 100% has anything to do with it, but I do think it's important to acknowledge that. And then if also to take it a step further, if I'm a young female teacher, perhaps, or just a female teacher in general, and we know, I learned this, and this was years ago, that these kids are getting big, man. When I was mentoring in the 5th grade, there was like a girl who was like only a few inches shorter than me.
Mhm.
I was like, man, like, what are they putting in this food? You guys are growing up like that,
Mhm.
And so I say that because I can understand a female teacher being intimidated, right, by some of her students, especially if they're, comparable size to you, and they get upset. It's like, yo, this could be a problem.
Mhm.
So having a male teacher, again, I'm not trying to make a point that men are better than women, but
Yeah.
I'm saying in terms of like security, if I feel like I'm more under threat because these children are about my size, very, very upset right now, and I'm not sure how to de-escalate them, or what I'm doing to de-escalate them isn't quite working, I can understand you like calling security or needing to get that student removed. But I also know that men, we might have a different approach on how to resolve that issue, where we
Yeah.
might not have to recruit somebody else that might cause police to get involved, charges to be filed, a student getting kicked out of school. You know what I'm saying? Like
Yeah.
there's proper ways to escalate based on that situation. And I think men, we would handle it a little differently because we are a little bit safer to engage in those types of discussions or trying to resolve these very hostile, intense moments. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that. That's my perception.
No, no. Yeah. Like, I mean, it's tough in the environment we find ourselves in, like our current climate. Let me not say environment, our current climate, right?
Yes.
Because we got to be careful with what we say. We don't want to
Sure.
offend nobody, but I think it makes rational sense that there are some things that women are more equipped with to deal with other female students,
Yes.
and men may be a little bit better equipped to deal with things that are for male students. And
Yes.
just from sheer like you're bringing up the physical side of things.
Yeah, like size. Yeah.
Yeah, just sheer size, right? Like, and you're a male student and you're upset, even if it's somebody that you respect, you may be physically imposing or intimidating at that moment. But a male teacher that might comparable in size or even bigger, it whether or not you want to admit it will change. It will shift that interaction, right? So just like
thank you.
Just side or reputation. Like I know so and so down there. I know about him. Just sheer reputation is kind of like, oh yeah, you know what? Yeah, Cook, you know this. No, I'm ready to talk. Yeah, we can talk about that for sure. Like it just makes sense to me, just a pure rational sense. So
absolutely. I'm with you. Thank you. And of course, like, you know, trust me, I'm very mindful, not because I'm like nervous about what I say, but I make observations, you know, like I'm not in the education space. I'm not going to presume, but I've spent a fair amount of time in there. And yes, as you just pointed out, I agree. I think if you have a man, not that you have to be like 6'5" or something, but I think we tend to command a certain presence.
Yeah.
And if a young man is upset, I'm not saying that he's not going to still be upset, but I think there's a greater propensity to get him to calm down.
Yeah.
Because there's another man he's conversing with versus a woman he may not, you know, that might represent, not to go too deep, but that might represent like his mother at home. And maybe his mother shuts him down often. So then he's looking at this teacher as like an avatar that represents the way his mom is. And maybe dad's not around. Yeah. But then Mr. Cook comes in, he's like, oh, okay, it's a serious business. Cool. And of course you're inviting, you know, you're warm. You're like, hey bro, like, what's going on, man? Come sit down. Let's chop it up. Let's talk.
Yeah.
And it feels more comfortable to maybe engage in that. So instead of me throwing the chair, throwing the desk, getting handcuffs put on me and taking to juvie, maybe I just had to step out of the classroom for a bit so I could cool down.
Yeah.
And then I can come back and continue on with my day. I make that point because, again, I'm talking sort of about the environments that we're in and the lack of male leadership, perhaps, and from a teaching standpoint. That representation isn't there. You agree with me there that there's much more female teachers than there are men.
Yeah.
I think that can play a role.